Hello and welcome to Undesign the Redline virtual tour with your hosts, Sanjita Pradham. We now join the conference in progress.
Awesome. So throughout the presentation, if you guys have any questions, comments, remarks, please continue to share them in our chat box. We'll try and get to them as much as we can. But I'm sure as we go through the presentation and we have an awesome panel of community leaders talking to us a little bit, sharing their perspectives, I'm sure a lot of them will be covered, but we'll try and get to your questions as much as we can. So to start us off today, we want to do a quick poll. And so if you want to get your phones out or if you are on your computers, there's two ways that you can join this poll. You can go to your web browser and type pollev.com and enter Sanjita P913 to respond to the poll, or you can take your phones out and type 22333 on the number and then type Sanjita P913. I'll give people just a quick minute to join that poll. I'll go to the next slide because the instruction to join is right up here in the slide as well. So we want to get to know you a little bit and see how many of you are familiar with this topic. If you're very familiar, type A. If you're somewhat familiar, you can type B. If you're not familiar at all, you can type C in your answers. And we are getting to see that there's somewhat equal number. Maybe a lot of them are more familiar with it. 17% right now, not familiar, 16, almost equal numbers. So this is giving us just a good way to get to know who's in the line and how much familiar you are with the topic. Looks like folks are still joining us. So I think this is a good place for us to transition to the next part of our presentation. And I wanted to thank Polk County Housing Trust Fund and Lauren Johnson specifically for working with us to get this presentation for us. Lauren, you want to take it over?
Great, thank you so much, Sanjita.
Sorry. Yep. Let me stop sharing my slide
No
so
problem.
You can share your slide.
Great, and I'll start sharing mine. Thank you so much, Sanjita. We are so excited to join you all today, talk about this very important subject that the Trust Fund has been talking about quite a bit, and we're happy to spend this time with you this afternoon as well. My name is Lauren Johnson. I'm Director of Communications and Community Outreach at the Polk County Housing Trust Fund. The mission of the Polk County Housing Trust Fund is to provide strategic leadership, expertise, and resources to strengthen communities by expanding affordable housing choices in Polk County. And we do that in a few different ways. One way in which we do that is through the funding of affordable housing. So this ranges from new construction of affordable housing to preserving our existing affordable housing stock, owner-occupied repairs, as well as funding programs and supportive services that aim to get people into permanent housing and then to keep them in that permanent housing. The second way in which we do that is through our research and planning work. And this is really looking at the data to better understand the needs of our community. And with that research and planning work, we then are better able to do the third part of our mission, which is to advocate for housing-friendly policies across the metro and across Polk County, and to advocate based on that research, and that research can guide our funding, and it also guides our advocacy work. So we're very, very happy to be here with you today, and thank you to Sanjita and everyone at the partnership for the opportunity to give this presentation this afternoon. So the Polk County Housing Trust Fund first brought this exhibit, Undesign the Redline, to Des Moines just over a year ago, so in April of 2019. So the exhibit was created by a firm out of New York City called Designing the We. They're a social impact firm, and they've been taking this exhibit around the country now for a few years now. And so going to cities as big as Los Angeles, California, to cities more comparable in size, such as Omaha, just our neighbors to the west. And so what we did last April was we brought the base exhibit, which really looks at the history of redlining on a national scale and the history of that policy and its effects and how it's led us to where we are today. And we had a really great reception and really great interest to that initial base exhibit. And so with the help of our sponsors at Wells Fargo, the Directors Council, and the Mid-Iowa Health Foundation, we were able to expand upon that work and dive into the Des Moines specific research to better understand how the policies of redlining impacted Des Moines specifically. So we conducted that research throughout the fall of 2019. And then in January of 2020, early January 2020, we were able to unveil the exhibit at Franklin Junior High. And from January to about mid-March, we had well over 1,500 folks come through that exhibit and take a guided tour to better understand that history. And I must say, some of the conversations that were had in that room were just so enlightening and very productive on a kind of community organizing level. So as you can imagine, about midway through March, we had to suspend the in-person tours of Undesign the Redline, but are happy to now be giving these tours virtually and to be relaying this information in a new and frankly exciting way. So before we get more specifically into redlining as a whole, we do want to take a look at the current state of Des Moines, just to serve as a reference and to serve as kind of a primer to understand how these issues have impacted us at a local level. So to do this, we draw from 3 different reports. All of these reports are available on our website, undesigndsm.com. And so the first report that we looked at was the One Economy Report, the State of Black Polk County, which was released in 2017. And so the data from 2017 showed us that African Americans in Polk County are denied loans at a rate almost over double the Polk County average. And furthermore, housing values, the median value of single family homes in Polk County in minority census tract in 2017 was half of that in all census tracts. Additionally, in 2010, African Americans in Polk County represented 11.2% of all renters, while representing just 6% of the county's total population. So this really tells us that African American families are renting at a higher rate than white families throughout Polk County, and renting at a rate that's disproportionate. And why might this be? Well, going back to the first data point there, African Americans are denied loans at a rate that's double the Polk County average. So in the same year, in 2010, African Americans represented 65% of cost burden renters in Des Moines. And in the housing world, we speak about cost burden quite a lot. And so what cost burden means is that a family or an individual is spending over 30% of their monthly income on rent. So of course, this inhibits them from being able to spend those funds on other things when most of the monthly income is having to be spent on housing costs, which also includes rent and utilities. So after seeing this report, it's very clear that there is quite a disparity in the housing sphere when it comes to African Americans in Polk County. So looking on the right-hand side of your screen, this is a recent map from the HUD Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Data and Mapping tool, which really just shows the distribution of the African American population and the white population in Des Moines. So the green dots that you see on your screen represent African American households, and the white dots represent white households. So as you can see in this sort of rectangle between University and Hickman and east of MLK, the I don't know why it keeps skipping there, but the African American population is fairly concentrated into that sort of rectangle. So just keep this map in mind as we go forward to look at a few additional maps that will kind of put this all into context before we get into the subject of redlining. So the third report that we draw on to better understand the current conditions in Polk County and in Des Moines more specifically is the Neighborhood Revitalization Report, which was commissioned by the City of Des Moines in 2018, sometimes referred to as the CZB report. So we're going to look at 3 different maps from this report in particular. This first one that you see on your screen now is the current property conditions throughout the City of Des Moines. So it's scored 1 through 5. 1 signifies the properties that are in excellent condition, really staying on top of the details, and then goes down to 5, in which those properties are deemed to be in high levels of distress. So as you can see, again, kind of in this rectangle area that we saw on the first map, which has a high concentration of the African American population, a lot of this area is in high levels of distress, as well as moderate distress and average condition. This is also the case for this northeastern side east of the Des Moines River. So the second map, very similar to the first, is the current property values throughout the City of Des Moines. So the lighter the color, the less the property value. So that light yellow color signifies properties in which the value is less than $100,000. And then that dark blue color signifies the properties that are $300,000 or more. So as you can see, on the western side of the city, it's a lot darker. And then getting into, once again, this rectangle area in the northeast side of the City of Des Moines is quite a bit lighter. So what this report did, and here we go, what this report did, it then combined those 2 maps that we looked at just a second ago, so the property condition and the property value, as well as a few other neighborhood data points, and came up with the current neighborhood condition throughout the City of Des Moines. So unsurprisingly, on this southwest side is green, and the green signifies that it is a very healthy neighborhood, and then that kind of dark magenta and pink color signifies that those neighborhoods are unhealthy or very unhealthy. So once again, in this rectangle that we pointed out on the first slide, we see that most of that is pink or maroon, magenta, whatever you may call it, and then also on the east side of the river here. So this really, this information we like to present up front just so you can keep this in mind, one, while we go through the presentation, but then also as we get into the discussion portion, to really think about how this historical information that we're about to go through has impacted what our city looks like today and what our neighborhood conditions are today. So now we will get into redlining. And first, I want to read this statement that the trust fund created to serve as a sort of primer, a mental primer for getting into these issues. America has promoted the notion of white supremacy since the country's inception. Beginning with 250 years of slavery, the country forced a segregation of the races, both geographically and economically. The end of the Civil War did not change those segregationist attitudes. From Jim Crow laws separating whites from blacks in public accommodations to anti-miscegenation laws, America sought every avenue to make sure races did not mix. Housing was no different. And as we will see as we go through this information, housing was actually really used as a tool for that segregation. So what is redlining and when did it come about? Redlining, of course, not called redlining at the time of its inception, really came about in 1934 with the creation of the Federal Housing Administration. So it came about as really a solution to a problem after the financial crash, and it was rolled in with the New Deal social safety net and wealth building programs that were introduced during the Roosevelt administration. So the issue that it was meant to address was this problem of a rise in delinquent home loans throughout the country that was really problematic for the bank's books, but also a problem for the wealth building of families, right? So there were a lot of underperforming or non-performing loans on the bank's books. And so in order to solve that problem, there was a government-sponsored corporation called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was created to refinance those mortgages. One way in which they did this actually ended up creating the invention of the 30-year mortgage that we know today, the 15 and 30-year mortgage, because at the time, the terms for these loans were much shorter. So by lowering interest rates and then expanding the length of the loan, that helped grant more families loans. So interestingly, the government did not want to just give these loans to just about everybody. They wanted a sort of risk assessment tool to ensure that they knew folks were going to pay back these loans, and to ensure a few other things, as we'll get into shortly. So the way in which they made these risk assessment tools was that they made maps, now known as redlining maps. And these maps looked at different neighborhoods and rated them from green to red, green being the best, red being the worst. And of course, those in red are now known to be those redline neighborhoods. These were created for 239 cities across the country in the 1930s. And so we'll go through exactly how these maps are to be read and really what they meant. So the green areas, unsurprisingly, were the best areas that had the lowest risk. Blue was seen to be a neighborhood or an area that had kind of reached its peak, but still did not have that high of a risk. And when we're talking about risk, we're not just talking about risk of that loan not being paid back, that federally subsidized loan being paid back. But as we'll get into in the next slide, risk was also considered to be a risk of quote unquote infiltration of hazardous populations. So hazardous populations at this time were really anyone who was not deemed to be white. And at the time in the 1930s, the white population was really just considered to be Northern European. And so the Jewish population, Southern Italian population, as well as African Americans, Latinos, were considered non-white. And so if a neighborhood was seen to have risk of the non-white population moving there, or if they already did live there, that was more likely to be deemed yellow, which is declining and higher risk, or red, which is hazardous and the highest risk. So in effect, the loans were granted in the green and blue areas the most, yellow not as much, and then red, virtually no loans were granted in these redline neighborhoods. And this really starts a ripple effect by cutting off the investment from the federal government and the housing sphere to these red regions. It starts with federally backed home loans and then trickles down to private home loans, business loans, insurance and bank locations, just really any sort of economic investment that you could imagine was cut off in these regions. And so what this did was it embodied a process that transformed explicit racism into structural racism. And the geography and wealth gap that these maps helped create at the time largely still exists today. Because really, what is the fastest way or the best way to build wealth in this country? It's home ownership. And by cutting off the access to home ownership for these many, many families across the country, it substantially contributed to the wealth gap that we know today, the racial wealth gap that we know today. So how exactly did they define these neighborhoods? every redlining map had a corresponding set of area descriptions. I think we're waiting for the photo to load, but these area descriptions are when you see the language such as infiltration of hazardous populations. And this is where we begin to see that the red areas were primarily based on the race and the ethnicity of the residents that lived there. The green areas they weren't just deemed green because it's where white people lived, but because the folks who were making the maps, oftentimes out of work realtors or property assessors, they were ensured that there was really virtually no risk of this kind of infiltration, which was talked about. And the way that they were ensured that there was not that risk is because oftentimes in those neighborhoods, there were racially restrictive covenants, which stated that people of color could not live either in that neighborhood, or sometimes those covenants were in the deeds of the homes, stating that you cannot sell this home to a person of color. Oh, there we go. So now you can see a photo of one of those area descriptions, and you can see D6 consists of laboring class and on the west side is a colored district, so specifying the demographics of the folks living there, specifically in those redlined areas, that they were people of color. So now you see on your screen the Des Moines redlining map. So I'll leave this up for a minute and point out a few things as well. So as you can see on the western end of the city, you have a big chunk of a green area. Something you may notice is that there are these B areas surrounding the A area, and that was not an accident. So oftentimes the B areas were used as a sort of buffer to ensure that the A areas would not in fact be quote unquote infiltrated. And so with that in mind, you can see that there is something a little bit unusual, and that is this little section or this little island of green that's in the midst of yellow and red. And so once again, this is unusual because usually there were buffers to ensure that those A areas would remain in good condition. And so the reason that that little section is green is because that section is Chautauqua Park, and Chautauqua Park did have a racially restrictive covenant, and which stated that no African Americans could buy a home in Chautauqua Park. So once again, this ensured the folks making the map that there was no risk of this quote unquote infiltration in this neighborhood, thus deeming it A. So of course, these maps were created for 239 cities across the country. That is certainly not every city in the country. So for those cities that did not, cities or towns that didn't have a redlining map and the corresponding area descriptions, they all still had an underwriting manual, which really just consisted of the same of the same language, telling lenders to look out for these hazardous populations and prefer areas with restrictions on infiltration, such as the racially restrictive covenant that we just talked about in Chautauqua Park. And so interestingly, you know, this was not, once again, it was not specific just to the federal government, because it started to and also was influenced by the private industry. And these things were actually practiced from 1920 in the private industry, just really looking out, making sure that the races did not mix, and using housing policy as an avenue in which to ensure that. So now we will get into the timeline. This is really the centerpiece of the physical exhibit, and it goes through 4 different eras of really federal housing policy, and then looking at the local policy as well, and the effects on the local atmosphere. And so as we can see, we have era 1, which goes from 1800 to 1930, era 2, 1930, really starting with redlining up to 1960, Era 3, 1960 to 1990, and Era 4, 1990 to today. And really what we get from looking at this timeline as a whole is the fact that these policies often had consequences that were not adequately addressed, adequately addressed as time went on, which created kind of a cycle of more inequitable policies taking place of the former inequitable policy, which really leads us to the issues that we still know today. So, of course, this story does not just start in the 1930s with the New Deal and redlining. Racism goes back hundreds of years, really to the 1800s, and earlier than that with slavery. But the Midwestern story in particular really begins with the Great Migration, in which at the end of the Civil War, as racial terrorism starts to rise in the South, folks are fleeing north. And the northern cities are, for the first time, really confronting a change in the population, which was formerly, a majority white, and still is today. So between 1910 and 1920, now we're getting into some of the Des Moines information. Between 1910 and 1920, the African American population in Polk County increased approximately 62%, which is quite a lot. And there were many ways in which cities, because I'll go back and say once again that the federal government was really not involved in any sort of housing policy until 1934. And so local governments were practicing things as this Great Migration was happening, such as racially restrictive zoning, which was working quite well up until 1917, when the Supreme Court outlawed that. And so that's when, after 1917, and that's struck down by the courts, that's when we start to see the rise of these racially restrictive covenants and deeds at the local level. And really what this started to show the federal government is how effective segregation by racial restrictions on property development were, and really kind of laid the groundwork for what was to be redlining just a few years later. There we go. All right, and so on the left-hand side of your screen, as part of our research on this project, we dug into the Des Moines Register and Tribune archives, and we found, these are just two examples, there were many, many more, advertisements for new developments that specified that we cannot sell to colored people in this tract, and we cannot sell to colored people, as you can see. So this was really no secret, right? This was very, very out in the open as time went on. And this practice of these racially restrictive covenants really was popularized between 1910 and then 1930. So as far as the timeline is concerned, we are going to skip over the 1930s and 40s, as we really just discussed that at length, and the policies of redlining at length, and skip right over to 1950 and see how this segregation was taking shape. So by 1950, segregation of African Americans into certain neighborhoods in Des Moines was really complete. And as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, this is a map that shows exactly where African Americans in Des Moines were living in the year 1950. So as you can see and may guess, the numbers signify how many African American individuals are living in those tracts. And really it is, once again, concentrated into a certain part of the city. And so you can see here, there's 2,188 African Americans living there, and just go up a little bit northwest here, and there was just one in that tract there. And you may wonder, well, why was there one in that tract or over on the northeast side? And the article that accompanied this image or this map in the Des Moines Register and Tribune did specify that these areas were actually, or these numbers usually signified live-in help in those areas. So going forward from 1950 to really 1970, this is where we start to see the federal policy and the policy in Des Moines start to intersect. And that is with two specific policies. The first is slum clearance and urban renewal. So as time went on, of course, about 20 years after redlining was put into effect, there started to be a problem in cities, and it was known as a slum problem. However, folks didn't think about, well, why were these areas of the cities disinvested in? That wasn't thought about at the time. Really, the thought was, well, what can we do about these areas that aren't really looking that good now? An activist at the time called this Negro removal, because 72% of people displaced throughout this were people of color. So I'll go back and explain that what was happening was that these slums were being identified and then in effect being cleared out to build something new there and get rid of that quote unquote slum problem. So in Des Moines, over 1,200 families were displaced at this time and due to these policies. And in the River Hills Renewal area, which you can see is on this section, once again, from the Des Moines Register and Tribune, on the right-hand side, that's the River Hills Renewal area. Approximately half of those which were displaced were African-American families. And I'll also say the Des Moines specific information about this policy is that the urban renewal slum clearance policy was rolled into the construction of the freeway and the construction of the interstate. So the thought was take out the slums that are causing us some issues and then put in the interstate in its place. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see that construction taking place. And really another issue with this is that families were losing wealth as this process was occurring. So one family stated, we were paid only $5,500 for our 3-bedroom house and are now forced to buy a 2-bedroom house, not as good, for $9,500. So this is these are 3 aerial shots of the construction of the freeway. In 1950, do notice that a lot of this was residential property. And then by 1960, that was taken out. And by 1970, the construction of the freeway was complete. But really take a look at these areas and the transformation that occurred, and think about how many folks that were living in those areas had to buy 1 new house and in some cases 2 new houses as this displacement occurred. So the River Hills urban renewal story is pretty interesting. I won't spend too much time on it, but on the right-hand side of your screen, you can kind of see what was planned for that area. And unfortunately, many of those plans did not come to pass, but the plan of displacing many families did come to pass. So this map on the right-hand side of your screen shows the relocation of those River Hills residents. So as you can see, the River Hills renewal area is outlined, as is the Oak Ridge renewal area, which was the second renewal area to really be deconstructed. And so taking a little bit of a closer look, you can see dots all around the screen, and that signifies where folks were moving to. So the circles with the black dots inside of them, those represent white families who were moving from the River Hills renewal area. And then the circles without black dots in them represent African-American families who were leaving the river, or who had to leave the River Hills renewal area. So as you can see, if you really look close at this, those white dots, or the circles that don't have a black dot in them, are much more restricted in their movement around the city. And of course, that is because they were unable to move to any part of the city, or even, outside of the city to Urbandale, Windsor Heights, West Des Moines, that they would want to, because of racially restrictive covenants and other policies such as that were in place. So obviously a lot was lost with this, but specifically with this policy of urban renewal, there was one really important piece of Des Moines history that was lost, and that was Center Street. Center Street was really the center of Black-owned businesses and really the Black community in Des Moines, with barbershops, social clubs, jazz clubs, which attracted musicians from around the country and at times around the world. Pharmacies, just really anything that you could think of. And all of this, but really this small bustling economy within the city of Des Moines was taken out, and nothing has really ever come to take its place as something that is a home for a community, but also something that spurs economic development and business in the Black community in Des Moines. So following the policy of urban renewal and the construction of the freeway in Des Moines, we see the rise of the white suburbs. On the left-hand side of your screen, that is the quintessential photo of a white suburb. It's Levittown, Pennsylvania. And so, you know, white flight at this time happened for a few reasons. One, the interstate was being put in, so it was easier for folks to get to and fro. But more importantly, white families were really afraid of properties devaluing because of the diversification of those neighborhoods. So oftentimes realtors would really scare some of those white residents and say, well, you know, some African-American families are starting to move in a street over. They're going to get to your street, and your property value is really going to plummet. And so those families would then leave those inner ring neighborhoods and move to these newly developed suburban communities. You know, that's a story that we all know, but what is often not mentioned is that the Federal Housing Administration had a requirement of white-only subdivisions with the construction of these new suburban communities. So builders of the suburbs received federal loans, but only on the explicit condition that the homes would not be sold to Black home buyers. So once again, just restricting where African-American families could choose to live. There was really no choice. And so at the same time, public housing was being built in cities, and that housing became increasingly concentrated with poor families of color. Additionally, when we think about going back to kind of thinking about redlining and how this concentration and really destruction of wealth started to happen, it's important to note that in those redlined neighborhoods, there were some people who could buy homes in that area. And really, it was restricted to people who had cash on hand to buy those homes and did not need a loan from the bank or didn't need a loan from the federal government. And so what ended up happening is that, you know, investors would go into these declining neighborhoods, buy a home in cash, and then start renting out that home, not taking care of that property, and renting out that home to African-American families. Really just starting this cycle of, you know, a disproportionate amount of renters in that community that we still see today, that we saw in the One Economy report. So once again, this really wasn't a secret in the city of Des Moines. So this is a clip from the City of Des Moines Commission on Human Rights in 1961 that really just speaks for itself. Negroes have been almost totally excluded from the purchase or rental of the 15,379 homes built by private enterprise since World War II. At this writing, no builder will sell a Negro a house in any development now in progress. 86% of all Negro households in Des Moines are located in our most rundown sections of our city. So before we get into the discussion, there are a few more points that we would like to present to you. The first, and what's really important, is that, of course, there was a very strong community response in line with the civil rights movement in Des Moines. And so we'll run through some of that response pretty quickly. So one is the Katz drugstore. So in 1948, Edna Griffin, her daughter Phyllis, and a few friends were refused dining service at Katz drugstore at 7th and Locust, downtown Des Moines. That case of discrimination was actually ended up going to court, and Miss Griffin was successful in that case. So that was really important for the civil rights movement in Des Moines. Additionally, the NAACP was very active in pushing for and protesting for discrimination in housing and the lofty pricing of new housing developments due to the displacement of the African American community because of the River Hills and Oak Ridge urban renewal projects. And additionally, what a lot of folks don't know is that the Black Panthers were actually very active in Des Moines as well, and they were successful in really pushing for the increased hiring of African Americans, getting Black history taught in school, expanding the capacity of schools being attended by Black students, and holding the Des Moines Police Department accountable for treating Black suspects and prisoners with respects and rights. And before we move on from this slide, would also like to point out this photo on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, which may just look like 5 men standing in a field. But if you look a little bit more closely, you'll see that there's some kind of road behind them. Well, that is actually 5 men who are standing on what used to be Center Street. And this was taken in 1968. And so they are coming back to see what used to be, you know, the center of their community. And as we have gone through so many photos and documents really examining this issue in the city of Des Moines, this photo really stands out as one of the most poignant images that we've seen. So additionally, and I will say that all of this information that I'm about to talk about briefly is available in video or audio form on our website, undesignedsm.com. But as part of the research process to bring this exhibit to life, we formed a community advisory group to really get some qualitative research and some qualitative information to better understand how folks were impacted by all of these changes. And those stories are incredibly enlightening and also just quite striking as well. And so I will share quickly one of the stories that struck me upon listening to it, and we call them stories from the line. And that was the story of a young kindergartner who was displaced from her neighborhood, had to move to a neighborhood on the east side of Des Moines, had formerly attended Crocker Elementary School. And of course, Crocker Elementary School at that time was destructed in the urban renewal process. And so that student had to move to a different school along with about 20 other students in her grade from Crocker Elementary. And after a little less than a year in that new school, discovered that all the students from Crocker were placed into special education because the new school assumed that those students were not able to read because they went to Crocker Elementary School. And so that really just goes to show how housing and how the history of housing in Des Moines impacts so many different aspects of people's lives. So getting into the current day on the timeline, really the issue that we like to look at is, and that is talked about quite frequently, is reinvestment and gentrification. So for the first time since the 1930s, neighborhoods that were formerly redlined are primed for investment. We're starting to see demand for people moving back to city centers, and with that, investment is coming back. However, with wages stagnating since the late 70s and financial insecurity becoming a lot more common experience for everyday American families, the city's vulnerable residents are encountering an affordability crisis. we know that here in Polk and Dallas County, 44% of residents are rent burdened. Once again, meaning that they're spending more than 30% of their monthly income on rent. Additionally, we know that there are only 42 units available for every 100 families in need of housing in Polk County. So as we see this investment return, we have to really keep in mind the errors of the past and take a look at how we're putting that investment in, ensuring that we are not displacing anybody, we are not cutting off people's access to that affordable housing that they sorely need, and that we're building more equitable models going forward. So where do we go from here? And more importantly, how do we undesign the red line? You know, a recent study showed that 74% of residents across the country of formerly redlined areas are minority residents. So how can we do better in the future? Well, our friends at Designing the We really have a 3-step process for doing so. The first step is to reframe, and that's reframing the conversation in a more historically informed way. So in effect, that is what we're starting to do here today. So thank you again for joining on this important call. And it's also not only thinking about things in a historically informed way, but also taking a step back and re-examining our own personal biases as we think about some of these issues that affect our community. The second step is to redesign, and that is talking about the redesigning the way that we do community engagement. So rather than thinking of community engagement as a box to check off before going to the next step, thinking of it as an opportunity to get input and feedback from communities and peoples that are affected by the changes that are being made, to better understand their concerns, to make more equitable decisions about those policies that are being proposed. The third step is to reinvest. So rather than reinvesting in a way that could be seen as gentrification, reinvesting in coming up with new ways to really have a community-sourced funding model going forward that is informed by the first and the second steps of this undesigned process, and reinvesting and creating more equitable models to do so. So before I hand it back to Sanjita and we get into our panel discussion, I do have a few questions to leave you with here. One, how do we bring investment into a community that connects and builds wealth broadly with communities and heals the wealth destruction that we've talked about today? How do we involve everyone in the problem solving of these issues from the ground up? And to leave you with this, that we always must keep in mind when we're discussing these issues, that if our solutions don't affirmatively mitigate past injustices, then we are most likely exacerbating them. So with that, I will hand things back over to Sanjita and Joshua and Marvin and Angela, and can't wait for this discussion. And thank you again for joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Lauren, for that presentation. I don't know about all of you, but I find this very, very fascinating, interesting, heart-wrenching, all of it, all at the same time. And our purpose today, like Lauren mentioned, is, yes, for us to learn our history, because that's very important for us to take action today and making sure that we all work towards building that equitable community that we all want. So today we have a wonderful panel of community leaders here who are going to share a little bit more about their perspectives on the lingering effects. As you all know, I'm seeing some comments on the chat box saying decades later, our communities are still dealing with this. And yes, a lot of times I personally feel like we hear this term systemic and institutional exclusion, racism, discrimination, bias, whatever you want to call it. And I'm not quite sure, that everybody understands what that actually means. And that's why it's very important to go back to history in understanding that our starting lines are not the same for all of us. The starting line is 5 steps behind for me, 10 steps behind for someone else. And when we're all interested in this topic of diversity, inclusion, equity, we will not be able to do that in a meaningful way if we do not understand that very fundamental principle that it's not equal for all of us. The starting line for me is not the same as the starting line for someone else. And so without further ado, I'm gonna do a quick time check. I think we're doing pretty well. These 3 panelists don't need any really big introductions here. Everybody, they're very well-known community leaders. So we're probably gonna go ahead and get started with Marvin. Gonna share a little bit about your perspective. And then we're gonna have Angela Weekly, who is our Community Inclusion Manager at Veridian Credit Union. Angela will share her own perspectives, but also give us very specific examples of what lending institutions can do, financial institutions can do, and a very specific example with what they did at Veridian Credit Union. I'm sorry, I flipped it around. So we'll start with Joshua Barr, because as you've seen in the presentation, the work that his office does is very important in this conversation. So without further ado, I am going to pass it on to Joshua.
Thank you, Sanjita. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So here's the thing, and I think James Baldwin says it best. History is not the past. It is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. I mean, you have to understand that this is us. And the question is, what do we do with the things that we now know? The purpose of history is to, utilize those things and transform it. So Lauren did a great job of talking about redlining and the historical impact, but that's left a lasting legacy. Part of that lasting legacy, and first of all, you have to understand, we live in the United States. We are a market-based capitalist economy where the dollar is king. So when you talk about the United States, even now, if you look at this pandemic, we're talking about economics, not just human beings, but also the economics. So when you look at the lasting legacy of redlining, let's look at building wealth. And so when you're trying to build wealth, 42% of Americans hold their wealth in home ownership. But if you are of African descent or Latino, you're much more likely to be denied conventional mortgage loans than similarly qualified European Americans. We and the Latino community are typically charged a higher interest rate on government-backed mortgages, as well as during the economic crisis of 2008. A big part of what caused that crash was these subprime mortgages, and Blacks and Latinos in particular were foreclosed on at a much higher rate. Home ownership in the United States for the African American community is the same rate it was in 1970. So we have not really moved. And for every dollar that a white person owns of wealth, Black people have less than 10 cents. So the median net worth for a family of African descent is $9,000. Compared with $132,000 for European American families. But again, that wealth building happens from the past. Most wealth is actually inherited. 60% of wealth is actually inherited wealth. So, but if you look at the historical legacy of taking lands from other persons and the indigenous people, taking it over, not abiding by your treaties and agreements and handshakes, then taking that land and having other people work that land, and then those people fight to free themselves, because although they say Lincoln freed the slaves, 187,000 Black persons fought after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and that is what lifted the ended the Civil War. You still have a number of persons who were put in American apartheid, or better known as Jim Crow. Then you have lynching, and now you have mass incarceration. You have the breakup of the family through slavery, and the continued breakup of that through the Black codes. And you have disproportionate unfair laws, because we're a republic, a country of laws, that have put unfair burdens on persons that are of non-European American descent. So we have ongoing discrimination. The National Fair Housing Alliance estimates that about 4 million persons each year experience discrimination. And again, a lot of this is underreported because nowadays discrimination is covert, not overt. Nobody's yelling N-word typically, are saying racial slurs, but they're saying, sorry, we can't accept your loan. So the thing is, we have a lot more work to do. And to break this lasting legacy, we have to embrace our history, say this is us. Now, what do we do to change it? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Angela, maybe Lauren, do you want to go to the next slide? Yeah, Angie?
Yep. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. So we talked about some historic data that affects us today, and we talked about how it affects us today. And when we say us, it can't just be the African-American, Latinos, communities of color that make change. It has to be all of us. It has to be Americans. And so what are some things, we talked about what are some things that we can do individually, and then what can we do within our organization? So on this slide here, you'll be like, you can see some of the things that you can do individually. For instance, when you know information, make sure that you're sharing it. An example of this is as soon as I had an opportunity to learn about having the data for the redlining, my entire lending team, from the chief lending officer down, attended a redline conversation, which was news to all of them, right? So the more that you can do to share that information, using your authority to be able to share that information, the better. Like Joshua said, money speaks. We are a very economy-based community or country. And so where you spend your money and where you don't spend your money matters, right? So you can vote individually with your dollars. You can make sure that you're banking at institutions who are not using the discriminatory practices of not allowing African Americans and Latinos to own business, to own homes, to access regular financial money. I don't know if you've experienced this during this pandemic, but paper money, which a lot of communities, underrepresented communities are using paper money still, is very hard to use right now because people don't want to take paper money, but we haven't allowed them to be educated or to be able to use mainstream financial institution. And maybe Marvin will talk about Bank on Iowa. Maybe he won't. I don't know. He is kind of over that as well as one of the ways to do that. And make sure that you are supporting local businesses, and not just local, but local businesses that are owned by people in communities of color. For instance, I'm pretty sure I eat Chinese food more than I ever would because I know that they're being discriminated against a little bit more right now. I pay more money for my mulch because one of my former students who happens to be African-American owns a shop, and it's in my neighborhood. So I'm supporting as much as you can with your dollars to say that because your dollars actually do matter. The quote that Lauren ended with was basically saying what is listed here, where if you don't intentionally do something to make the change, then you are indeed part of the problem. If you don't know, if your network doesn't show difference, partner with organizations that could allow you to have access to the populations that you are needing to serve with. The Evelyn K. Davis Center is an absolute excellent organization to partner with in many different ways. If you're looking at supporting local business, minority-owned business, that's one way to do it. If you're looking at, changing that wealth gap by educating young people, he does a summer youth program where you can have a student come and intern with you. So there's lots of opportunities for those different things. From a financial institution standpoint, one of the things that we did, we are a low-income designated credit union. What that means is that 51% or more of our members, is what we call our clients, are low to moderate income. And so we don't have to do anything to do that to get that designation. All we have to do is support the data of where we lend, right? We were able to take that a step further and become a community development fund institution. And what that is that you are providing financial resources and services in low to moderate income or communities that are lacking the opportunities for banking. And so we were just doing that by way of kind of being a credit union. That's kind of what we do. So we became a CDFI. And with that, you can take some dollars. So when Shanjita was talking about a specific example of something that we've done at Veridian, so we know that we're not unlike most institutions in how we lend. Only 2% of our African American and Latino communities were being able to get our home loans. So with our CDFI, we were able to take a smaller number. We were able to take up to $21 million and invest it into communities or with people who we have to look at things differently. So I don't know, Lauren didn't talk about this, but if she talked, one of the things that did come out of that housing crisis, we didn't used to have credit score and debt to income ratio, which if you don't have wealth, and those are the things you look at to lend to people, it makes it very hard for them to lend. So we were able to then take the debt to income ratio, which is how much debt you have and how much money you have coming in, which will look different if you're renting and you're not getting 30% and you're paying more than 30% of your income for your housing, right? We're able to look at debt to income ratio at a different rate. We were able to look at credit score differently, and we are able to increase that to 20% in this specific loan. 20% of African Americans of that specific loan are for African Americans and Latinos. So that's just one small thing. $21 million is not a lot of money, and it is a lot of money when you're able to affect a community. And you can take different steps. And now we're looking at being able to expand that program. So looking at what resources you do have, what do you already have, and then what are organizations that you can partner with, and you can make small change even by just voting with your dollars. And now I'm going to pass it over to Marvin.
All right. Well, thank you, Angela. So to kind of continue down this road of what you can do as an individual, before I kind of dive too deep, I just kind of want to touch base a little bit on what Lauren presented about and Joshua mentioned too, around this urban renewal that was highlighted here in the 60s and around the 235 with Center Street, and just understanding that, you know, this was a nationwide, I guess you'd say, movement. There's examples in various cities around the country where urban renewal impacted African American communities that were thriving and the basis of a lot of the economic success in those communities, and they were completely wiped out by other examples of highways like 235 going through these communities. And even now, even though it's been a slower process than the first urban renewal back in those 50s and 60s, you see this same process occurring now in a lot of larger cities. It started slowly in places like Chicago, Los Angeles, and it's picking up momentum, and you can see it even here locally again in some spaces. But that is happening again. It's just we haven't got past it for it to be officially recorded in history again. But just understand that some of those same principles are occurring now. So for me, just kind of picking off what Angie introduced as far as like our Summer Youth Experience Program, again, as much as I would love to work with all of you, we're not the only show in town. So, I mean, there's other organizations that are working with youth. You have Oak Ridge, Urban Dreams, Children Families of Iowa. there's other agencies as well, but the thing is being intentional about partnering with organizations that are definitely working every day with the populations here impacted, particularly African American or other communities of color as well. So if you don't give them opportunities early, you set them up to could possibly continue through this same cycle that we've seen, that was even demonstrated through what Lauren talked about in housing. A lot of these systematic processes have been occurring for decades in other spaces, whether it's education, housing, health, and of course, financial inclusion. So the earlier we can provide that to bridge that gap and give these youth the same opportunities that a lot of us can remember as our first job and that first experience earning income, it just helps to set the stage to kind of really help break this cycle of this generational poverty that we see a lot of times in some of these communities because of lack of opportunities. There should never be a case in this country that we live in to where you cannot find your first job until you're somewhere around between the ages of 18 and 21. That shouldn't be the case. So the next thing, of course, there's tools. What can you use to help maybe to run through when you may not be sure on what you can do or how to approach it? Capital Crossroads 2.0, they introduced an equity tool that you can use if you're not too clear about it. You can utilize in your decision-making process in these meetings, right? Again, it's not the end-all, say-all, but at least helps to kind of set the frame and the tone of which direction you could head as you go through this decision-making process to make sure that you're being intentional and inclusive in your decision-making processes. Another thing, the soon-to-be released One Economy report around Blueprint for Action, myself with Joshua and quite a few others, working in different work groups around different topics, have worked hard to really come up with different metrics and strategies that, again, not the end all say all, but at least starting points to where we can start to make impacts and changes for the African American community, African refugee and immigrants, and can easily be applied to other populations as well. So again, these are just tools that as they come out, and then some of them are already currently existing, you can definitely make a change. And so then, of course, supporting political candidates that express their desire to address these inequities. Now, you could say, yes, we've heard a lot of promises from politicians in the past, but I think in this current climate that we're in, I think it's really important that we're really listening and making sure we're aligning ourselves with individuals that are being vocal about making these changes and having impact in these spaces. Because if they're not talking about it, then you can pretty much guarantee that there's going to be business as usual. So if they're not talking about it, that's a clear sign that either one, they don't want to talk about it, or they're just not going to deal with that particular situation. So definitely have those conversations. I mean, I know it's a little harder now because we're in this virtual space, but you can always ask the questions and for yourself to be informed, hear what kind of response they have, ask their staff. Sometimes you may not get a direct opportunity to talk to a candidate, but you definitely are around their staff, and you'd be surprised the questions you could ask the staff. Sometimes they can kind of give you a insight to what that candidate's overall views and points are by either one, their great answers or their lack of an answer. Because again, as they're running in that space, your entire team is usually informed of what your platform is. So that's one way of it as well. And then, of course, like Josh always says, you can run yourself. Don't be afraid to jump out there and be that candidate for change. And so I always say too, do a self-evaluation. Look at yourself, the man or woman in the mirror you look at every morning. Just ask yourself, what is it that you can do? Look at your own network. How are you practicing this change? How many friends of color do you have? Have you ever had? I mean, those are the kind of things you have to kind of have serious conversations about, because if you haven't, unfortunately, like what Lauren said too, you're not a part of the change. You're not having this impact because you're still staying within your safe, confined spaces and not really taking that move to put yourself in an uncomfortable situation to learn. Uncomfortability to me provides opportunity for learning and change. and it can be tough. But I think having these kind of presentations, we've been talking about it for a while in a lot of groups that I'm a part of as well. But you know, in the previous slide, it said having the conversation. We're at a point now, really, I would say we're almost, we shouldn't have to have the conversation, but as I've been learning in myself and just some of the things that come out from even the 1619 project, another resource if you're not quite familiar with all the things of the past, from one of our own local Iowans, Nicole Hannah-Jones. She just won a Pulitzer Prize. There's a lot of information that you can go and find out for yourself that, just to be quite honest, it wasn't in your history books as you went through high school and even different college courses, unless you specifically took those classes. So do your own evaluation and try to figure out where you can go and learn new things and be a part of the change. And I'll stop so we can kind of open it up for questions. Oh, actually, I'm handing it back to Joshua. Yeah, Josh.
Do you want to take a few questions? There are some questions, or do you want to cover the slide first, Joshua? You're muted.
Someone asked a great question about whether or not banks actually, how do they know whether or not a bank is investing into marginalized communities? So Angela, do you have an answer for that? You're the banking expert. I thought this.
Yeah, I was going to field some questions here and give you guys an opportunity, but do you want to start with that then?
So in all honesty, I don't do any lending at the credit union. I do all of our community outreach. And with that said, I know that we do have to submit, financial institutions have to submit information. I posted it for everybody for NCUA and FDIC as part of their lending practices. They have to submit some of that information. Not to get too far into the differences between credit unions and banks, but credit unions are very community based, so you can ask that information when you are looking for a financial institution, and then banks have what's called CRA, where they have to reinvest some of the dollars that they've received back into the community, and that also most of those financial institutions will share with you the information of how they are using their CRA dollars in order to do that. But all financial institutions will have a report on how they lend and what types of lending they do. So, yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
The specific question was, do banking organizations publish data that pertains to their support for marginalized communities? Is that the one you were referring to, Joshua? Okay.
Yes.
There's one that Chris asked early on that I'm trying to scroll up to find it. I think it goes something like, how would you describe or define community-based funding model? Does anyone want to take that?
Can you repeat the question?
How would you describe or define community-based funding model?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. So what we're really looking at and what is recommended in that area is looking at things like land banking and community land trusts. So ways in which the community has more say and is more involved in that investment process. Also, another thing that's recommended is impact investment. And I think that more information about those models in particular is available on Designing the We's website. That's something that they look at. And I think most specifically, that kind of land trust model, so that everybody has a hand in that sort of investment, if that helps answer the question. But that's really the model that we've been looking to, and that many other communities across the country have been looking to as a possible solution to this issue.
Thanks, Lauren. There's this other question. Are there any existing pieces of language still in our mortgages or covenants today that are still harmful? most people don't actually read this word to word, and it might be eye-opening.
Oh, go ahead, Eric. Yeah, that's the perfect question for you. Yeah.
So yes, is the answer to that question. This is Eric Burmeister from the Polk County Housing Trust Fund. There are such things, and they're just a lot more subtle. And so the fact is that we have evolved, I guess, to a certain extent from the days where those covenants said that no house can be either owned or occupied by anyone other than of the Caucasian race. Now what you see are covenants, and including zoning ordinances from cities that do things that make new housing and neighborhoods unaffordable to folks that generally are of color. So you find the zoning ordinance or the restrictive covenant that requires that a new house be able to park at least 2 cars under cover and 2 additional cars off the street in order to comply with the city requirements. You find covenants that require houses to be of at least 1,900 square feet in some cases. You find out that lots for new construction must be at least 75 feet wide. And that, so what happens is that the new housing just simply becomes too expensive for a lot of the communities that have been at a financial disadvantage for literally generations. So I guess sometimes when you see those sorts of covenants, ask yourself, why? Why is this there? And if you start to peel the onion, you'll find that they're there because it excludes what we've become to call those people.
Thanks, Eric. There is one other question, and I'm monitoring our time here for everybody. What is the next step for Polk County Housing Trust Fund and the community to overcome redlining, promote home ownership, and build wealth in communities of color in Greater Des Moines?
That's a good question, and interestingly enough, that is a question that that our board is going to consider between now and the end of the year. It so happens that this is the time in our history when we will be working on our next long-range strategic plan. And we will be looking to see where this particular, particular work that we've been doing, educational work that we've been doing, fits into what we plan to do for the next 5 years. But understand that our board is highly invested in the issue of housing equity and making sure that when people think of Central Iowa and the Des Moines area, that they think of it as a great place for everybody to thrive and not just a place for a few people to thrive.
I would think one of our panelists might have something more to add to it. Anyone want to add anything else to that?
Sorry.
Joshua, go ahead, and then we'll come to Angie.
So I was answering a question on private, but I know who that person is. I'll send them. I'll reply to them later. So the thing we have to think about when building wealth, and maybe I'll try to answer that question right now, actually. So we have to understand racism didn't start out on a personal level. Greed and racism was manufactured. It started out institutional, and we made it personal. Some greedy persons incorporated it into European-based institutions, and then that took over the world. So therefore, to fix race, we have to change the institutions. But in order to change the institutions, we have to change as people. And so, so the thing that we have to look at is this: we have to watch, what we read, what we listen to, and who we hang around. You know, my wife, she's she's from Colombia, South America, and you know, she listens to love songs all day. And I'm just like, yo, love is beautiful, but life is bigger than love. We actually have to put the work in and strive to actually embrace the problems that we're dealing with. Right now, we're at a crucial moment in history. At this crucial juncture, we're in a pandemic, and right now is the best time to create an America or a Des Moines 2.0. What do we want our community to look like post-pandemic and during this pandemic? And so I say this, you know, the question was asked that if we tell persons to support non-European American institutions, are we telling people to stick to their own kind? I would actually say no. The way I've always looked at it is that we support everyone. We're collective. We can't have one race until we get rid of racism. So people like to say, well, one race, the human race. But we have to get rid of racism first, because racism was a divider in our community. But in order to build that leg up, if you look at this graph, there's a lot of things that certain communities have to overcome. And a lot of those things, the only way we can do that, you know, I can't give you back your history, but I can compensate you moving forward in the future. So we have to support all communities, all institutions, and all persons, not just European Americans, not just Black Americans, all Americans, but not just Americans. We have to support humanity. We're in a global pandemic. What do we do moving forward? Everyone is affected by this. So we want Des Moines to be the Des Moines that it could be, where it's prosperous for everyone. And again, I'm not saying everyone has to get the same outcome. I'm asking for everyone to get a leg up on opportunity. Everyone at least have access to opportunity, the opportunity they need to succeed. So as we're trying to create this Des Moines 2.0 and America 2.0, Marvin kind of touched on it. We do have to watch who we support in our politicians. What's the rhetoric that they're stating? But we also have to make sure that what are we voting with our dollars? We vote with our dollars every single day. What you watch, what you read, what you listen, where we bank. You can get the data on where banks are putting their money. And you say, I won't support a bank that's discriminating against certain neighborhoods, that's investing in certain neighborhoods. I won't support businesses that refuse to hire persons or is not representation of the community. And the thing is, you don't do it immediately. You put them on notice. Martin Luther King had something called Operation Breadbasket, where they protested certain organizations. Now, I'll end with this, because I really believe, and I'm really glad that Polk County Housing Trust Fund is doing this. King says a society is always eager to cover up its misdeeds with a cloak of forgetfulness, but no society can fully repress an ugly past when the ravages persist into the present. And he says America owes a debt of justice which it has yet begun to pay. And now we're at a crucial junction where it's time to pay the debt of justice for these essential workers that we don't pay well enough, but we want them to show up for work. So let's make sure we're investing in all communities. It always starts local. Politics always starts local, and it spreads. So Des Moines can be the community, that community on the hill that shines a light towards improving our community. Thank you.
I think that was a mic drop moment. Thank you for that awesome comment. I wanted to give just a little bit background on why we even hosted this conversation at this point. It may sound little off track, but it's really not. We are presenting this as a part of our diversity inclusion series, and what all of you already know by now, that the pandemic has, just like an X-ray, shown the inequities in our community. All of you are on top of the news. We've been hearing this over and over, that communities of color have been disproportionately affected and so forth. And that's why learning why, I think a lot of people ask me, why is it this way? And it's part of it is the history that has the set up for us is the inequitable ways that we've been set up. But part of it is we wanted to make sure all of you have been now thinking about how do we get back? What does our recovery look like? And we really, really, really wanted all of you, no matter what lane you are in, no matter what industry you are in, no matter if you are just an individual trying to make a difference, that we have to think about these communities of color who marginalized communities who have been disproportionately impacted. It will perpetuate again and again and again. And this is like a great opportunity for us as we're all thinking about rebuilding, as we're all thinking about recovery, on how to do that in a more equitable way. And this is my statement, my line that I use all the time is the starting line is not the same for all of us, and just for all of you to think about that while we're doing our recovery plans. What else do we need to do to get some of our communities at the level playing field? How do we need to, how can we cater to them? What are their needs? Their needs are different. So that's why we wanted to host this conversation. I think Angie had a comment, and we have 2 more minutes left that I wanted to allow last minute thoughts, closing points that any of our panelists wanted to make. And if I didn't get to say thank you, I really wanted to thank Lauren for all her work in helping us get this presentation out today, and all of our panelists for being available, and all of you really to be here with us for a 1.5 hour, which is quite a bit of time that we asked from you. So anybody wanted to share any closing comments, starting with Angie?
The only closing comment, I think Josh's comments, I would be great if they could be the last comments that were made. They were very lasting. And the only thing I would just say is, from a person who is invested in the community, and that's what Veridian pays me to do, is look at how we can be involved in the community. We need to support places with our dollars, with our philanthropy as well. So Habitat for Humanity, the things that Marvin is doing, the things that are where people are impacting young people, because if we don't work with our young people and help educate them, our economy cannot be good. So they won't have money to buy from the people from the greedy people, if they're not educated on how to do that, or have the means to do that moving forward. So we need to invest in our young people. We need to support organizations like the Polk County Trust Fund, the Habitats of the World, the Evelyn K. Davis Center. So we need to also support by voting our dollars in our philanthropy as well, is the only thing that I wanted to add.
I'll just add, kind of what Joshua was saying, and I'm glad he put it that way to potentially close this out. On that previous slide he had around wealth building, and it showed the median net worth. And I want you to remember those numbers, where it was $9,000 for African Americans, $12,000 for Latinos, and then $132,000 for European American families. Off of those numbers, I want you to understand that there was already a report out that in 30 years, 2053, the predicted median net worth for African Americans would be 0. And that's if nothing changed. But to what Josh was saying, we now have a pandemic. So there's another setback. So that timeline just got accelerated. So that's why it's even more important that everybody has to work together and really, really think about how can we create the American dream for everybody, because there's not a lot of time left based off of our current situations to be messing around and waiting another 10 to 20 years. We don't have that. We don't have that luxury. It's now. It's here and now.
Awesome. That was a great ending point here, and it's right on the dot at 3:01. So I want to thank again all of our panelists for Polk County Housing Trust Fund, and all of you. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and hope to our next webinar is on June 4. All of this will be made available in our website. Some of you have asked me if it's going to be recorded and uploaded and available, and the answer is yes. So thank you, everybody.